one of them should be bigger and one of them should be smaller. If they're not, let me know. If you haven't purchased that, let me know, and then we could also go from there, because I think I may have some in my office that are larger. I just as of the moment, like all I have right now at home is the small one. Somebody used the small one just as a test, and we can go from there. But again, guys, as long as you just have one is more than enough. The two are a variety, so kind of covers a lot of ground, which is really helpful. But I have a glass container here I'm using, and these are just like old candles that I used to have, and I just use them as like containers for water or from like oil mediums and things like that. I have another one here where I used for like watercolors, but I'm also going to be using this as my contaminated dirty container. And then I have my semi ink here. Okay, this is the ink that we're going to be using. Just be careful. Go ahead.
I don't know if it's just me, but the video is like small because I think you have your other computer unmuted, so it still says the regular.
Fatima, so when you go to Zoom, remember, go over to gallery, go to the top where it says view. Go to gallery, click on gallery, and then go hover over where my hand is waving. Do you see it? Like the camera is small, right? Hover over your mouse. Those three little blue dots come up. Do you see it? Click on pin. It'll make the whole thing bigger. That makes sense? Yeah. Anybody else need that? I can do that again one more time. Just want to make sure.
Repeat it. I didn't follow it.
Okay, so if you guys go to Zoom, we're all in Zoom, right? I'm not doing any screen shares yet. So go to the top where it says top right, where it says view. We see that?
Yeah.
Click on that, and then a drop-down menu comes up. There's gallery, there's speaker. Do you guys see that? Click on gallery. So it makes everybody all a square, right?
Yeah, yes.
See my hand that's waving? Okay, so hover over your mouse over that window or that box. You'll see three little dots that appear on the top right. You see that?
Oh, yeah, I can see it.
And then click on pin.
Oh.
Then it makes the whole thing large.
I got it.
Yeah. Did it work? Anybody else need any assistance with that? Okay. So your best friend is what? Tape. Your also best friend, your other best friend is some paper towels. Now, part of this, guys, is really important to remember that this is your eraser. And what I mean by this, if you add a lot of layers, for example, right? If you add a lot of texture or a lot of sort of ink accidentally, you have to think about your paper towel as your eraser. So I like to fold it into fourths, or you can fold it into how many pieces. You could cut it apart, right? Depending on how you want to do it. But you have to be really quick with time and sort of pick up your ink very quickly so it doesn't dry. Okay, that's really, really important. Before I start the demo, do I have any volunteers that have a reference that they were interested in using? And if so, we could use that for the demo, unless I could use the same one from last quarters.
I have one I was considering doing that I could share.
Perfect. Madeline, could you put that in the chat or send it as a message to me?
I can send an image?
Yes.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'll have to send it to my computer.
You got it. Take your time. While you're doing that, I'm going to get the paper ready. I have the saucer that I use. Again, this is like I use for teas and things like that, but I have so many of these. And they're really, really cheap, guys, if you want to just use one of like the small plates. But I try not to eat on this because this is like my sort of my ink preparation. I can kind of use as a guide. So I can just kind of rest my brush on there, which is great, instead of just kind of dipping it in my container. And my Strathmore paper. Now, I'm going to add some tape to my Strathmore. But before I do that, let me flip my sheet of paper. And I hate doing this part because I don't have any nails. So it's always frustrating. So what I'm gonna do is divide my paper into a rectangle. I'm gonna move it upright so we can kind of see both sides from the bottom and then to the top, because it's really important to see the differences between adding how much ink on the picture plane. So what I'm doing here is sort of just, again, freehanding and sort of framing my smaller picture plane to sort of coordinate with the scale of the reference. But unless Madeline has a better reference we could use for the demo. And this is what you want to do. You want to, again, map out your picture plane, but you need to tape it on all four edges, because the more water that you add, the harder it is for the paper to dry flat. And that's really important. It goes back to Colton's question about how long do you wait for the paper to dry, or how, and depending on the water amount, you have to first tape it down and see. You have to eyeball it and sort of figure out, if I add so much layers onto this sheet of paper, the paper is not designed to hold so much. And that's why you should really, if you can, take the sheet of paper out of your pack of your Strathmore pads, tape it to the table or whatever surface you're working on. Why? Because it will dry flat after you're done. Okay, that makes sense?
That makes sense. And I sent the picture.
Oh, this is great. This is a great image.
Yeah, I took it in Whistler right before the pandemic started in 2020.
Wait. Were you, hold on, because that's so funny, Madeline, I was there in February. No, late January, February in Whistler. When did you go?
I think it was like February 19th to early 20 something.
That's funny. That's when the Olympics were happening. Once like that time, they had
they have the Olympic statue, they have the Inukshuk's there.
Yep.
All of that.
That's amazing. Small world.
I know.
Beautiful place, by the way, guys. Whistler's beautiful, up north in north of Vancouver, Canada. Okay, so this image, and you took this image, correct?
Yeah, I took it. I forget what run it was, but yeah, I took this one.
This is great. By the way, I did not go skiing. I was really, really like just drawn to the landscape. So I was just like, oh my God, this is a beautiful place. So what I'm doing, again, Madeline, this is depending on if you want to do this. I'm going to zoom out slightly. So because of what I've done with the paper, I'm going to crop all that negative space where I don't need, so I can kind of lower it to here or raise it up or find my middle. Now, Madeline, because of since this is your image, where would you like it? Do you want it down here? Do you want it in the middle, or do you want more of your sky?
I was probably gonna do less sky because it takes up a lot of the image. So yeah, that crop looks good.
So right about here, let's give or take, right? Okay.
Yeah, that looks good.
Now, one thing you would do, now again, depending if you want to use this, you want to change your saturation. Why? Because this makes it a lot easier for you to see what your lightest lights and your darkest darks. Now, a rule would be the sheet of the paper is your brightest area, right? Now, in theory, and then depending on if Madeline wants to do this or not, you could also change the contrast. You see that? It gets dull. This is in the middle. Bump it up all the way here. It gets kind of too exaggerated, but if we kind of refine it to enough where it's like, maybe right around here to give more what? Value and separation of the value. And once you're happy, and then you can decide if you're happy with it, you can then say, okay, this is the image. Now, depending if you want me to do this, guys, and I'm going to just ask you, everybody now, do you want me to add a grid on top of this, or would you like me to freehand? It's up to you. And Madeline, you could decide too, because this is your image.
I think a grid would be helpful, at least learning.
Okay.
And how did you get down to the saturation and value menu?
So what I'm doing, I have a Mac. So whatever you guys use, I use preview, like whatever the image it comes in, like it comes up as. And I just literally go up in the top here where I go to file. Where did I go? I go to tools, adjust the color and size. I go to adjust color. This little icon comes up. You can kind of play around with some of these icons. There's so many things you could change. Highlight, shadows. This is interesting, right? And kind of see what works, what doesn't. Temperature. This is interesting. It's like a black and white photo now. But then you could also change other things. This one makes it much more sharper or something like that. It's interesting. Sharpness.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But again, if you have a PC, I apologize. I'm not that knowledgeable with PCs. So whoever can give some advice, that would be greatly appreciated, maybe through other colleagues. But that's where I would go because I just use preview. You don't need any fancy software. It's completely optional. So keep that in mind. Okay. And then give me 1 second. I do see the brushes. I think these might be the same. Nasreen, I'm sorry, I'm seeing the image right now you sent. How are the tips? Are the tips the same?
One of them is really sharper than the other one.
Okay, no, that's good. Then this is the right. That's right, because
Okay.
one should be for like smaller details. The other should be
Okay.
for like general spaces, so you can cover
Okay.
around. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You are very welcome. And then let me go back. So I'm going to stop doing a screen share, and then now I'm going to look at Madeline's photo. And now let's talk about the grid. So let me grab a pencil. Okay. Now, again, you could use any graphite pencil, but what you like to do, or you should be doing, is using a high 4H or any high H pencil. Why? Because it's a lot easier to erase. Okay. I do have a ruler. I'm going to make my diagonals. Let me just see if that's correct. And again, you're going to do the same thing for the image. So let's first start off with the drawing. So we got our diagonal lines that runs through left and right, back and forth. Our horizontal line, and then our vertical line, right? This should be pretty self-explanatory, but if you need more assistance, you can follow along. And again, you guys can also follow along while we are doing this demo. If you want to get in the habit of doing that, if you would like, it's completely optional. But at least you can kind of like find and make your mistakes now before you start your drawings. Where we can use Madeline's reference as the starting off point. That's some horizontal lines. Move it right over here. And then finally, add your vertical lines. This should not take no more, honestly, than a few minutes, no more than 5 minutes, I should say. If it takes way too long, you're wasting time. Because this grid is only good because of time. It's very helpful, right? Just slightly zoom out so we can see all four. Okay, guys, I apologize. My lighting in my apartment is not the greatest. Now we also have to do it to the image. So I need to do that on the image reference. So let me just do a screen share. And again, I'm using preview, right? Which should be free for everybody. Before I do that, I'm just gonna adjust the contrast to about halfway because I need to see my lines, okay? And what I do is use the cursor here to grab the hide markup toolbar and click the third icon, which is here, which is called sketch. And I literally just start making some lines. Okay. And this preview is great because sort of it automatically makes it nice and straight. That little dot shows, oop. Oh, what happened? Where did the image go? Hold on. Did it just shut down? Hold on. Where did the image go? Oh, the image went away. It deleted. Oh, no. Here it is. Excuse me. Oh, I see what it did. It made a copy. So it had to make a copy. Gotcha. Okay. We all can see that, right? Just want to make sure.
Yes, I can see.
Perfect. Okay, let's do this again. Okay. Alrighty, so we're doing a diagonal from the top right, bottom left, top left to bottom right, vertical. And notice when you move your cursor, it sort of locks it in yellow, which is great. Then you can add this as a guide, add that as a guide. Same thing with the horizontal. Okay. And then with our diagonals, we're going to mark them here to find these squares. And you're kind of moving your cursor to see where that green mark is. And again, I'm just using preview, just an FYI. But what you could also do is sort of say copy, paste. So Command C, Command V. Let's wait, hold on, that's right in there. Let's try this one. Drag it over here. And then we'll do the vertical lines. Sometimes I make these lines slightly off. I'll mark that there, and then we're going to mark. And there's not 100% perfect, but it's roughly there. Because I'm doing this digitally. Obviously, if I had a ruler, it would be much more precise. But I'm trying to use my, what is it called? My cursor on my mouse, which is always annoying. Okay, that's the reference. Question so far. It should all be self-explanatory by now, right? Now let's go to the drawing. So I have the drawing down, right? On the grid, I should say, excuse me. Now for the reference, I'm going to just pull it side by side on my end, so you guys won't see the reference. But again, Madeline, do you want a copy of this grid for yourself? Let me know if you do. I can send a JPEG to you, okay?
Yeah, I mean, if it's easy for you, sure.
Okay. I'm going to send that to, it's on the, hold on, how do we send this? There you go. It's on the chat, so feel free, that's yours now, because it's your image. So how I would start, what I do, okay, is first look at my picture plane, right? You're using a 4H, right? I'm done with my ruler. I don't need the ruler anymore, okay? What I can do now is literally start from anywhere and say, okay, so here's this mountain here, follow along these lines, right? And that's sort of where this angle is here. And this is my center, or I should say Madeline's center of their image. This is kind of where these curves are. There's some figures in there, right in here. And I'm just going very lightly, actually, just to kind of map out that composition, guys. Here's this point here. Kind of mountain comes downwards. Okay. And I'm just doing this very quickly. I'm not worried about any detail because I just want to see the placement of where things are, right? Because that's going to be what? All of the sky. You also, in theory, even without even applying your ink, you can erase your grid, but you just have to be mindful of how you don't lose too much of these lines. Okay. We got this area here. This one kind of connects to this area. all of this kind of curves down. There's a kind of a sharp edge here where we can add some more value. Just gonna frame that in there, right? Okay. There's this little hill. There's a kind of like this darker shadow here. I don't know if you can kind of see that. That connects here. And all of those details I can do later. So I'm not worried about that. All of this will be negative because that's that sort of perspectival space, sort of angles here. But there's also those little poles. I don't know if that's like a gondola or that's where like where the people who ski would kind of be placing or kind of like going along with that sort of structure. But there's that sort of really interesting perspective here where those figures are. I'm also going to add sort of, again, where this sort of hill is or this mountain, kind of how it angles, kind of cuts into there. And then again, the sort of angle on this side, and then kind of arches halfway between this square. It goes down. Continuing that back hill, this area goes here, more short, sharper edges, and that's it. Okay. That took what? About a minute. What you could do now is take your white eraser. And I know, obviously, intuitively, that's the sky. I don't need the sky's lines. So all those lines that we added for the top, we don't need anymore because we're done with the sky. So you could erase now. And notice I'm using a high H, which is a lot easier to erase. But let's say if you have a reference that's very complicated or has a lot of details, there's no need to erase yet. You could erase after your first layer. And I'm just kind of like removing the rest of the lines slightly. So then now, excuse me, if I just kind of gently, not aggressively, gently, I'm using a paper towel, remove all that excess eraser, you have composition. Okay, ta-da. Now it's really light, which is great because the more and more layers I add, the easier it is. I can start to see my tones and my gradations. I just got to be careful I don't get rid of all those lines that we drew. Some of them are still left, but I can always erase them later. But if you're sort of nitpicking and sort of figuring out like, okay, I don't want that to show on my drawing yet, erase it if it's going to bother you. So let's talk a little bit about this. I know it's a little hard to see, but we're going to add our first layer. So I have my container of water, right? I have my saucer. I have my ink. And I'm just going to very gently open it. And what I always like to do is kind of hold some paper towel on my corner, on my station, kind of leave it right over here. You could use the base or the tip of the container to add some ink. So for example, I have some of the paper towel here. I'm going to blot it. What that means is you're just tapping it on some paper towel so it doesn't have too much water. Here's my clean container, my ink, and then my area where I can blot it, as well as my saucer. Okay. If I just take a little bit of my ink, dip it in my brush just a little bit, and just use the tip or the cap of the semi ink, okay? I'm going to take some of the ink, put it on here, but also take it on the saucer. It's really dark. So I'm just going to lower that, put it on the table. You can see how dark that is. It's really, really dark. And it's very consistent. It's all even. It's almost really from the friction of the viscosity, which is the thickness or thinness of the ink or the water ratio. It's very thick. Now, if I want to dilute this, what do? I add water. So before I do that, I'm going to put this up here just for a second. Just be really careful, okay? I'm going to take this container while it's empty, okay? And I'm just going to put my brush in it. You can take your clean container and add a little bit of water. And I'm going to dilute that. Okay. What I also like to do is, again, because of my paper towels, okay, I'm going to put this container here. I'm going to take some of my paper towel, fold it into 4, and I'm going to test it. And I can blot it on here, and I can see, is that too light or is that too dark? Do you see that? That's way too dark, right? If I take another container where I have my clean water here, and if I can use another container filled with some water, I can also take my brush, mix it in this container, blot it. But if I had another container, this will be my third container. I can then now gradually add a little bit at a time to this container, right? Notice I'm just like kind of dropping my brush into this container and filling it in into this container, right? And I can do it again. I'm doing it a few times. And you could count, you can say 5 times. I'm doing this 5 times. And from that, you have a contaminated container, right? With some water, right? Now, if I also take some more paper towel, this is my first round, right? But I'll put that on the side. I'm going to take another one. This is why your paper towels are very key. What happens if I blot it? Look at that. That is a big difference. That's very light compared to here because it's more ratio of water. This is a good beginning. This stage, this is way too dark. Do not jump to these stages yet. You got to start from here and gradually add a little bit more at a time. Okay. So let's start adding in the composition. So what you do, okay, take this container and slowly start mapping in your composition. And again, I'm just doing very lightly. And I'm just hovering over these lines and just adding a value of the ink. Now it's so light, it's hard to see it, which is great because once you apply your ink, okay, it dries darker. Remember that. Your first layers, that's why you got to be really careful. You got to go nice and slow, okay? Add some layers first, gradually, and then wait for it to dry. Do not add too much water. You can see from the reflection of the light. Do you guys see that? That's a lot of water. That's too much. Spread it, move it to the surfaces, right? Move it around. And I'm going to have a nice sort of light scale, a gradation of here on the foreground because it's really light. That's not the brightest brights yet. I'm going to mix some tones first because I want to add some variation. Let me know if this makes sense, guys. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. You want to
I have a question.
Go ahead, Madeline.
This is not exactly about the technique, but when we're disposing of all our different diluted inks or whatnot, is it okay to put it down the drain?
You do it in the bathroom drain instead of the kitchen drain, just to be safe.
Like the bathtub, or shower, you mean?
No, the sink. You can put it in the bathroom sink. It's not deadly or toxic, guys. If you accidentally swallowed a little bit of ink, you're not going to die because it's natural. It's from the earth. It should not be toxic. The India is, the Sumi is not. India is a little bit more artificial, but nothing will happen to you, I can guarantee you. But just be safe. Try not to cross-contaminate it with your kitchen sink, where you prepare food, and but your bathroom sink should be okay with warm water, and it should go away with some soap.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. Thank you for that. I forgot to talk about that because the disposal is important. Okay, so far you can kind of see it's really lightly painted, right? I also notice the grayscale of what? The sky. So I'm going to add, and notice I'm moving it back and forth very consistently because I want to blend some of that grayscale. Okay, and I'm going to let that dry because I know in that horizon will be a lot lighter. You could also work upside down invertedly, but let's see what happens. I'm going to do something really extreme. Let's grab this again. I'm going to take this container, right, with some water. I'm just going to blot my brush with my paper towel. I always hold it in one hand, have my brush in the other. I'm going to take a little bit of the ink, just a little bit, and mix it here. And this is how you can add more layers gradually. I'm going to blot this. It's still similar, so nice and slow. A little bit more ink. Blot this. That's a little darker. Do you see that? It's a little darker. Let's try a little bit more. Just a little bit more. You want it. This is what you want to do gradually. That's better. So let's try adding more. Now, throughout the stage, at this part, the first layer, you have to wait for it to dry fully. Then you can fully go back and erase with your white eraser, all the graphite marks, okay? This is where you erase, okay? Does that make sense so far, everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, if I sort of jumped and add a lot of ink to the container, this is still roughly too light, and a little bit more. That's better. Yeah, that's better. A lot better. This ink here, if this gets dry, you can hydrate it, add water. It will come back from a solid. So if it dries as a solid and you can peel it off, add water and it can go literally back to a liquid. So keep that in mind. Okay. So if I add another layer, I'm going to add more ink here. Again, I'm sort of jumping the gun, but I'm adding a lot of ink at a time. Let's start adding another tone. So here's some more value. So I can see here. Do you see that? Now it's a little bit darker. And I'm just gradually working my way around the mountains. And this is a good image because it's not too complicated. Always blot because you don't want too much water. And notice I'm holding it on the tips, but you could also use the what? The sides of the entire brush to cover more ground. But just be careful. Don't add too much at a time. What other questions do we have?
Similarly, this is Hannah. Similarly to the ink being able to be reconstituted.
Yeah.
If we're going to be doing the painting over like day or over 2 weeks,
Yep.
will our different concentrations of water still be usable? Like, can they just sit as long as we like maybe stir it up?
Yeah, if you can stir it up at like every other day, yeah, I would stir it up just to kind of keep that consistency. Because let's say if you made this consistency perfect and you don't want to lose it, and that was the perfect gradation or perfect value you made in the first time, keep it. And then don't add more water, don't add more ink. But the problem is if there's a little bit of water, it may dry that way through time, right? Maybe through the temperature of the air or the condensation outside of the weather, if it's too hot, too cold. But I think if I kept this for about 2 or 3 days, it'll probably dry out. And all I'll have is some residue left of ink. The water will all go away. But I would say, yes, you can. You can cover it with the lid. You could use a plastic wrap, or some, some parchment paper or whatever it is that you can kind of cover it up, to kind of not let some air get in there, to kind of keep that consistency. That's why I always say go to like Chipotle or any restaurant, ask for those little to-go cups, or not the little sauce containers that they have with lids. Those are great, because you can move them around. You can kind of say, okay, that's gradation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can kind of have a whole variety of them. But honestly, as long as you have 3 containers, that's all you need. So that's what I would say. You can see here now, look, it's drying darker. Did that make sense, Hannah?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Now I'm going to do something really drastic. Do not do this at home, please. I'm going to take a lot of ink, mix, and now start switching it up and say, now this is going to be a lot of gray, but I'm actually grabbing more water and mixing it in here. Now you can see, take the same blotted paper towel. That is a huge jump. Do not do this. But what would happen if I did? I'll just say, why not? If I start adding over here, you can see it's way too bold or too dark or too light, depending on the value. But if this is the image, you can slowly start adding more and more value, depending on the gradation, depending on the light. But see these strokes, they will dry that way. So you have to be really quick. If you want to blend it, blot it with some water and slowly kind of blend that in. Because look, now it's almost dry on that side. Kind of want to blend in that sort of into the space. And that's why timing is really important, right? Because you could move one tone from another. It could also bleed. What does that mean? So if I just added just ink while it's still wet, it starts to bleed from one side to the other. Because why? There's too much water there. You can kind of move it. There's a physical tactile experience right there. You can kind of move it from one angle to the other. Same thing here, right? And now look, it's going too fast and I need to control the ink. That's why it's really important to be patient, guys. You can't rush this process. You cannot rush this process, okay? Same thing here. Notice I'm using the side of the brush, not the tip, holding it like a 90-degree angle. I'm just using the side because it covers more ground. But I'm doing this very drastically to kind of showcase different values. And I'm going to wait for these areas to dry, okay? But this is what you want to do. And this should not take that long, but you have full 2 weeks. So if you mess up, feel free to try it again or use your preliminary drawings as your first test. Notice there's still water on my brush. There's still water on the brush.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Madeline.
So with the preliminary drawings, maybe I missed this earlier, but with each of the different timings, are we meant to practice different ink concentrations since we can't really, we're not building on top of one drawing?
Exactly.
Okay.
You want to start off light. So based off of the sample online on the lecture, you want to really start off light first and then gradually add darks more and more once you have time, because it's the time that's more important than the actual entire space. Like, so you want to start off with the light tone and then gradually on your 4th preliminary drawing, you should take 8 to 10 minutes longer. And that should take probably more value because you'll have more time. Does that make sense?
Kind of. So we're on our last drawing, for example, you still would like us to start off light and build darker on top of that, even if we can't wait for it to dry much?
No. See, that's the thing. If you only have 2 to 3 minutes, so you make one value,
Okay.
And the first one in 2 to 3 minutes, and you go quickly, right? Just to kind of map out the composition. The second one should add a little bit more value, just a little bit more. And you'll do this gradually with your containers and say, okay, I'm gonna add a little bit more ink. And you're gonna see what tone that is. From the first one, you'll see, is that too light, too dark? Should I add a little bit more or add more water from the ratio? 50% of the work, guys, is mixing with water, right? Mixing the viscosity of it. The rest of it is sort of then trial and error to see how well it looks. Because again, notice right here, it's a lot darker now because we're adding more layers, but I want to wait for it to dry each time in theory. Okay. I'm just rushing along this process for the demo. But towards that final drawing, Madeline, I would say try to use maybe like a 50% ratio of ink to water. So it should be pretty dark gray, if that helps.
Yeah, that clears things up. Thank you.
My pleasure. So then now what I've done is sort of dip my brush in the ink, and now I have just raw ink with some water. So it's pretty dark, right? It's almost black. This is where you want to be really careful. So you want to just really gently, these are marks that are really mindful. So you got to like slowly see how they blend and curve or bend. Notice all of these strokes, each one is bleeding with the water. Why does that happen? Because the water is still there. It's not fully dry. So this is a process called alla prima, wet on wet. And this happens usually with paintings, with oil or acrylic paintings, or even with watercolor. That this process, you want to wait really, really carefully. But sometimes you can get some really nice strokes, or you can actually get some really nice angles or curves of a landscape, right? And you can do this with the minute details. So for example, that pole right over there, you can kind of fill that in right there. Those figures, that's one, that's two. And notice you can kind of see here when I zoom in, they're really, really small. But it shows what? The way in which the physical mark can resemble a figure in space. It's a silhouette, right? It's not a perfect rendition of a figure. They're silhouettes, meaning they're the quick image of the figure. And you can kind of see here, there's another figure right over there. There's another figure right over there. And notice they're all in that perspective, right? Depending on how you want to sort of tackle it. But then there's another figure. Oop, hold on. He's standing, he or she is standing up, right? So there you go. There he is, or there she is, right? And that's interesting because the more and more you look at this abstractly, right, the more and more you can have fun with this process. You don't want to tackle it head on like a typical charcoal or graphite drawing, because this is not charcoal and graphite. This is ink. You have to be very patient. That's why it's really important to take your time. Okay. But if I sort of went really bold and really quick, really fast, problem is you're sort of ruining the time for it to dry. So like right now I added these marks. That is way too dark, right? What happens if I add water to that? Look, it bleeds like crazy, meaning it starts to move all over the place. What you do through time and very quickly, take a paper towel and blot it as fast as you can before it dries. This is what happens when you quote unquote erase ink. You use a paper towel to kind of remove all of the excess water and ink, because you don't want that to dry that way. And the same thing with texture. So if I kind of added texture, for example, like where the snow area is, I'm just kind of blotting some of these areas to kind of show like shoe marks or footprints and perspective and kind of like angling certain things, because it's not a road, this is snow, right? And you can kind of have some fun with this process and just kind of see how it starts to develop. But remember, these are all pools of water now. They can all dry differently. But what I can do also is sort of tap my paper towel and remove it. So there's a lighter gray of a variation of texture of spots, of foot marks, or kind of way where the sort of the rest of the hillside would go down or up, depending on the value. And then same thing with the sky. Now, again, I have that consistent value here. I can start adding. Look how dark that is. That is way too dark, right? Now, if I really quickly take my paper towel, it's still there, but I took as much as I can off because that ink to water ratio is way too high. Now it's still a little blanched, so it's still a little wet. What happens if I add more layers? And I'm just doing this very drastically, guys, since obviously we're just experimenting. Add more water. Right? And what happens if I start moving my paper towel in a different direction, kind of like blotting it in kind of multiple directions? That line is still there. You have to be really careful when you add gradation because you want to keep a nice, even consistency. If you want to do a grayscale, by all means, feel free to do that. But you really got to take your time throughout this process, guys. I need to wait for it to dry for me to move on because you can start to see the paper is buckling and bowing. Once you step away from it in about an hour, maybe about an hour, no more than an hour, maybe half an hour, I should say, it should be dry. Okay. What other questions do we have about this assignment? Did this make sense so far?
Everything makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me too.
Perfect. Was any of this process confusing? And if it is, it's okay. I can do this again on another reference or the same reference. Okay.
Oh, checks out.
Perfect. All right, guys. Well, if we don't have any further questions or concerns, you are free to go. I will see you next week for midterm review grades. I'll send an announcement for how we're going to be joining that meeting. It'll be one-on-one for about 10 minutes for each student. We'll go over each assignment and talk a little bit about what grade you received for each assignment throughout the quarter. Other than that, I'll see everybody next week and the following week, as well as sort of presenting our critique on the 24th on Friday at 6 p.m. Dane, feel free to stay. We can chat one-on-one and then we can go from there. Other than that, guys, have a wonderful week and stay safe.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
You too, guys. Okay.